Rain didn't fall on Vesternine. It bled from the sky in thin silver streaks that steamed against the rusted roofs of the trade district. The slave lot sat at the edge of the spaceport like a wound the city had stopped bothering to bandage. No banners, no noise, just a row of beings in chains, price-lower than scrap drones. She stood at the far end, barefoot on the wet metal platform. Her skin held a faint violet undertone, dulled by exhaustion and grime. A pattern of faint luminescent lines ran from the side of her neck to her collarbone, half covered by the shock restraint clamped around her throat. She didn't lift her head when the handler barked her lot number. She didn't flinch when he tugged her by the arm to prove she was still conscious. Creatures beside her were claimed, prodded, purchased, dragged away. She stayed. 2 credits. That was the final call. The handler didn't even pretend to care if anyone bid. A few traders glanced over only to confirm what they already believed. She wasn't worth the oxygen she was breathing. Talon Rhett hadn't meant to be there. He came to Vesternine to buy a replacement engine coil and fuel cell for his freighter, not a living being. His coat still carried the dust of the Helion Ridge Passage, and he hadn't slept since the jump through the Ion Straits. He should have headed straight for the hangar, but a malfunctioning freight drone clipped his shoulder outside the bay doors, spinning his direction off by a few meters, straight toward the auction yard. He should have turned back, but his eyes caught on movement. Not desperation, not defiance, just a stillness too deliberate to be defeat. Every other slave on the line shifted, trembled, tracked the buyers with feral calculation. She remained motionless, as if her body understood that acknowledging the world would only invite more of it. He stopped walking. The handler saw an opportunity and spat out the price as if it were an insult to even speak. 2 creds. No guarantee she talks, understands, or eats. Take her or move on. Talon didn't step forward. Not yet. He just stood there, letting the cold air settle through his bones. He told himself he was only staring because something about the collar looked outdated, illegal, maybe. He told himself walking away was the smart choice. Someone behind him snorted. Not worth the ration packet it cost to feed her. Someone else laughed. Leave her. She'll be dead before shift change. That was when she lifted her head. Barely, just enough that one eye caught the light. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't hope. It was simply awareness, quiet and unmasked, like she was memorizing the faces of those who had already decided she didn't matter. Something in his chest tightened. By the time he realized he'd moved, he was already in front of the handler. He didn't speak. He just pulled 2 thin credits from the inner pocket of his coat and set them on the tray. The handler blinked, surprised he'd actually done it. No refunds, he muttered, unlocking the collar with a rusted key. The device hissed as a clamp released. She swayed slightly but didn't fall. Talon expected her to look at him. She didn't. She kept her gaze on the wet metal ground as though eye contact were a language she was forbidden to use. Does she walk? He asked. The handler shrugged. She moves when pulled. Don't know if she'll follow on her own. Try not to let her collapse on your ship. Cleanup fines aren't cheap. Talon didn't answer. He reached out and touched her wrist lightly, not gripping, just guiding. Her skin was colder than he expected. She didn't resist, but she didn't respond either, not even with a glance. They stepped off the platform into the thin crowd. No one watched. No one whispered. She wasn't a mystery or a scandal. She was a purchase, and a foolish one at that. He led her through the narrow service alley behind the trade depot. The world smelled like ozone leaks and burnt metal. Distant engines rumbled in docking bays. She stayed half a step behind, silent, weightless in presence but not in thought. He could feel it, the way some people fill a space even while trying to disappear. At the edge of the bay, he stopped beside a stack of supply crates. Rain sheen clung to his hair, and a pulse throbbed in his jaw he hadn't noticed before. He turned to face her. For the first time, she looked directly at him. Her eyes were not violet like her skin, but silver-gray, ringed with faint bioluminescence that flickered once and faded. There was no gratitude there, no fear, no curiosity. Just a question he couldn't hear but somehow understood. Why? He didn't have an answer, not one he was ready to say aloud. He hadn't planned on speaking to her yet. Not while the air still smelled of steel rain and commerce, but the silence between them felt too sharp, like a cut left open. Her gaze held for a breath, then dropped again as if eye contact was something she was only allowed in stolen moments. "Can you walk up the ramp?" he asked. His voice came out quieter than he'd intended. She didn't answer. She didn't nod. She simply stepped forward in measured silence, passing him as though she already understood which ship was his. Talon hesitated. Either she was guessing, and lucky, or she had been trained to pick up intent from the smallest breadcrumb of behavior. Neither possibility sat well in his mind. The docking bay door of his freighter, the Marlin, recognized his biometric signal, hissing open with a low hydraulic sigh. The interior lights were dimmed to power save mode, casting everything in a muted glow. The cargo bay smelled faintly of oil, sterilizer, and the afterbite of fuel exhaust. Nothing in it was welcoming, but it was clean, and it was his. She paused just inside the threshold. Not in fear. He'd seen actual fear before, but in a way that suggested she was taking mental inventory. Escape routes, hazards, shadows. He wondered how many places she'd been taught to survive before this one. "You'll need rest," he said. It felt strange, addressing someone who gave no sign of hearing him. She stood barefoot on the grated floor, soaked from the humidity outside, hair plastered along one side of her face. The collar had left an angry red mark on her throat. There was a faint tremor in her left hand, barely visible. He pointed down the corridor. "There's a med berth and sanitation unit through there. You can use it." Another flicker of pause, then she moved. Her steps were light, almost soundless against the floor. Habit, not intention. Talon followed at a distance, unsure why. Maybe to make sure she didn't faint. Maybe to confirm she wouldn't try to steal a shuttle pod the moment his back was turned. Maybe because leaving her alone felt like pretending she wasn't his responsibility now. The med berth wasn't much. A narrow cot, a locker, a set of folded clothes from a past crew member who'd left after one too many near-death incidents. The basin unit flickered with a low-power hum. She stopped at the doorway. He set a blanket down on the cot. Unsure what words might land gently, if any, he settled for, "You're safe, hey?" It wasn't entirely true. Safety was a spectrum, and he wasn't arrogant enough to pretend he controlled all of it. But she looked up just slightly, as if tasting the shape of the word in her head. He turned to leave, then caught himself. "Do you understand me?" She blinked once. It could have meant anything. He didn't press. He stepped out, closing the door partway behind him without sealing it. In the cockpit, the quiet pressed differently. He slumped into the pilot's chair and exhaled for what felt like the first time since the auction. The fuel cells were already half-loaded. The nav screen blinked a standby route back toward the Helion passage. He should have taken off immediately. Instead, he sat there, elbows on knees, replaying the moment she'd looked at him. Not with gratitude, not with fear, but with a question he couldn't answer. He didn't even know her species. Something humanoid from the outer territories. Maybe. The luminescent markings suggested genetic lineage from Lissari clusters, but they were usually taller, and none were sold this far from their nebulae. He'd seen their kind in trade manifests, not cages. A soft sound came from the corridor, metal against metal, light and hesitant. He rose and followed it, not rushing. She stood just outside the med berth, no longer dripping, wearing the oversized shirt and drawstring pants he'd left. Her hair, now dry, fell halfway down her back in uneven layers, like someone had cut it for convenience, not care. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring at one wall panel, where the emergency beacon light blinked every 10 seconds. Not fear, vigilance. He spoke gently. "You don't have to stand there. You can rest. The cot is." Her hand lifted, cutting the air with a subtle motion. Not aggressive, not pleading, just stopping him from finishing the sentence. Slowly, she turned her head toward him. Her lips parted just enough to shape sound, but what came wasn't a word. It was a question in a tongue he didn't understand. Soft syllables, 3 notes, spoken with caution. Talon didn't move closer. "I don't know what that means." She watched him, really watched him, as though judging whether his confusion was a threat. After a moment, she touched her own collarbone lightly, just where the illuminated markings began to fade. Then she spoke a single word. It sounded like a name, or what used to be one. He repeated it, careful with the consonants. "Sarah." She blinked once, slower this time. Acceptance, or correction without protest. He nodded. I'm Talon. He waited, unsure whether she cared. She didn't speak again, but something in her posture changed. Not softer, just less braced, like a muscle unclenching beneath the skin. He gestured back to the berth. You can sleep. We lift off soon. She glanced down the hole, then back at him, as though calculating risk. Finally, she stepped back into the room. He didn't follow. Before the door slid shut, he caught a final glimpse of her sitting on the edge of the cot, not lying down, not curling inward, just sitting, alert, like someone who had learned long ago that rest wasn't absence of danger. It was a gamble. And Talon realized something unsettling. He had no plan for what came next. The Marlin lifted from Vestra 9 under a bruised sky, engines low and steady, leaving behind the storm-slick metal and the voices that had already forgotten she existed. Talon didn't check whether Sarah was strapped in. He doubted she'd ask for help even if she needed it. The ship shuddered as it broke through the atmosphere, then stilled into the silence of open drift. He keyed in the autopilot and leaned back, rubbing the heel of his hand across his brow. His reflection in the viewport looked older than he remembered. Not in years, just in the tired way people age when choices sit too long in the chest. A soft, almost accidental sound came from the corridor. Not a voice. More like air shifting around footsteps too careful to echo. He didn't turn his head. Instead, he spoke without looking. You can come in. There was a pause, as though she weighed the intent behind the words before crossing the threshold. She stepped into the cockpit, eyes tracing the panels, the reinforced glass, the stars spilling silver across the dark. He'd seen refugees look at the sky that way, like it was both a map and a threat. She stood near the co-pilot seat but didn't sit. He could feel her caution, thin as wire but drawn tight. I won't lock you in there, he said quietly. You can move around the ship. She didn't acknowledge it. Her gaze drifted to the navigation display, then to the bulkhead marks from old impact scars. Her fingers brushed a panel edge, not touching full against it, as if surfaces remembered things she didn't want to feel. Talon didn't ask questions. Not yet. He'd seen too many people break under curiosity dressed as concern. After a moment, she shifted, studying him, not the way someone gauges danger, but the way someone compares memories to reality. He held her gaze this time. You said your name. Sarah. He kept his tone even. Do you remember how you ended up in that yard? Nothing moved in her face, but something changed behind her eyes, like a shadow turning. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked past him, toward the stars. The silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. He tried a different path. You were marked. The luminescence on your skin, is it from your people, or was it done to you? For a long moment he thought she wouldn't react. Then she lifted 2 fingers to the side of her neck, tracing along the faint lines as if confirming they were still there. Her hand dropped. No words, but the gesture was enough to tell him it wasn't decoration. A low beeping cut through the quiet. Incoming dock query ping. Another ship passing through the relay lanes. He checked the signal. Just a transport hauler, nothing armed. His shoulders eased. When he turned back, she was watching the stars again. You can sit, he said. She didn't. But she didn't leave. After a few minutes, she spoke, barely sound, more breath than word. It came in her language again, the same tone she'd used when she first said her name. He didn't understand, but it threaded softly through the room. I don't know what that means, he admitted, not pretending otherwise. She studied him, as though measuring whether honesty cost him anything. Then she did something small but deliberate. She placed her hand flat on the co-pilot chair's backrest. Not sitting, but claiming space. Talon adjusted the autopilot, then stood. I'm going to prep food. If you're hungry, it's there. I won't make you eat. He walked out before waiting for a response. Respect wasn't always comfort. It was sometimes distance. The mess hall was barely more than a narrow alcove with a bolted-down table and a thermal unit. He heated a ration pack and set out water in a metal cup. Habit had him preparing a second plate, though he'd never shared meals with anyone aboard. He wasn't surprised when she appeared in the doorway. She didn't step in right away, eyes flicking across exits, corners, objects within reach. Finally, She crossed the threshold and stood beside the table without sitting. He slid the plate forward. She didn't touch it. Instead, she lifted the water first, tasting it like someone checking for poison, on memory. Only after a long pause did she lower herself onto the bench. Not fully, ready to move. Talon sat opposite her, unwrapping his own pack. They ate in silence. She used her hands, carefully, as if utensils were a luxury not meant for her. Halfway through the meal, she looked at him, not by accident, not in passing. Her eyes held to his like she'd decided something. The silver in her irises shifted faintly, catching the dim light. What did they tell you when they sold you? His tone was quiet, almost neutral. She didn't speak. Instead, she lifted her hand to her throat and pressed lightly, where the collar had been. Then she tapped the table twice with her fingertips. 2 credits. That was all. He felt something in his chest twist, subtle but sure. "You're not cargo," he said. Her expression didn't change, but she didn't look away. Outside the viewport, the stars thinned into the dark stretch before the next drift lane. The hum of the engines filled the silence. She finished eating, then stood, not rushing, but ending the moment with choice, not fair. Before she left the room, she said one quiet word in her language. Not her name, not his. He didn't understand it, but he knew, with a certainty that unsettled him, that it wasn't nothing. When she was gone, Talon sat alone and realized something he hadn't allowed himself to name. She had stopped being silent, even without words. The stars outside the viewport had thinned to long streaks of white as the Marlin slid into drift speed. Talon rarely contacted stations unless he needed supplies, but fuel reserves were dipping lower than he liked. A single stop at Vesper Station, quiet, mid-orbit, off the patrol grids, would have been routine any other day. But nothing felt routine now. Saya hadn't returned to the cockpit since their silent meal. He didn't try to follow her. Some people needed walls before they could stand without them. He respected that. While the ship glided on autopilot, Talon busied himself with maintenance tasks he didn't actually need to do, checking cabin pressure readouts, scanning signal interference, recalibrating the navcoms for the 3rd time. Anything to avoid the quiet thoughts circling the decision he still hadn't named. Halfway through a fuel line diagnostic, the comms terminal chirped. A proximity ping, short-range scan. Not strong enough to lock on, but directed. He frowned and checked the frequency. Civilian code, unregistered, which meant someone close and someone cautious. He opened the spectrogram. The ping repeated once, then vanished. He didn't bother calling out to Sarah. She wouldn't understand, and he didn't want to alarm her. Instead, he sealed the diagnostic panel and returned to the cockpit. He muted the external response beacon, just in case, and lowered their signature by a fraction. Whoever sent the scan didn't follow. The empty space behind them stayed empty. Still, a knot settled in his stomach. He checked the autopilot route again. Vesper Station hovered 3 hours out, orbiting a half-collapsed mining planet stripped of anything valuable decades ago. Trade ships passed through, but patrols didn't linger there. He should have felt safer heading toward it. He didn't. When he left the cockpit, he found Sarah standing halfway down the corridor, not near a berth, not near the mess, just still, as though she'd been listening without moving. She looked at him, not questioning but sensing. He didn't try to hide his tension. She watched the way soldiers do, the kind who survive by studying breath, not words. There was a scan, he said. Then he paused, realizing she might not follow. He adjusted. Another ship, searching. Something shifted in her shoulders. Barely a movement, but not surprise. More like recognition. He tried again. Did someone own you before the auction? Someone who'd come looking. Her gaze lowered briefly, not in shame, in calculation. She stepped closer, not reaching toward him, not stepping back, just closing the space enough that he could see the luminescent lines of her neck faintly pulsing. He spoke slowly. If there's danger, I need to know what kind. She met his eyes then. No hesitation. No attempt to soften the truth she wasn't speaking. For a moment he thought she might break the silence and tell him. Instead, she did something else. She reached toward the panel beside them and pressed 2 fingers against the emergency seal latch. Not engaging it, just showing she knew exactly what it was. He understood her meaning before he fully pieced it together. She wasn't warning him she would run. She was telling him she knew how to hide. He let out a slow breath. "All right." She dropped her hand and stepped back, but didn't leave. He leaned against the bulkhead. "We'll reach a station. I need fuel. Food. Maybe parts. You can stay on the ship. I won't leave you behind." She watched his mouth as he spoke, as if she were trying to translate without language. Then she looked away, but not dismissively, just thinking. When she turned her head again, he was caught off guard, because for the first time, she spoke in a way that sounded directed at him, not just uttered in his presence. Quiet, low, deliberate, 2 words in her tongue. He listened, committing the sound to memory without guessing. She touched her wrist gently, then the space at her collarbone where markings glowed beneath skin. Then she lowered her hand and said nothing more. He understood none of it, but everything about it felt intentional, like a warning disguised as identity. Later, when she returned to the berth, he sat alone in the mess with his untouched ration and traced back all the faces he saw in that marketplace. None had looked like hers. None had watched with silence sharpened into memory. He didn't know who she belonged to, if belonging was even the right word. But someone had once put a collar on her who believed they'd see her again. And someone like that didn't give up something they considered theirs, not for 2 credits, not for anything less than trouble. He knew then, without naming it, that the scan earlier wasn't a coincidence. Hours passed. The ship's lights dimmed into night cycle. Talon eventually forced himself to sleep in the captain's alcove, one boot still on, come alert and gaze to vibrate against his wrist. When his eyes closed, he saw again the moment she looked at him during the meal, when she hadn't looked away. It unsettled him more than the scan, because for the first time since he bought her, he realized something he'd been trying not to admit. She wasn't afraid of being found. She was afraid of being recovered. Vesper Station loomed like a rusted ring suspended over the dead blue of the mining planet it once fed on. Docking clearance came with the usual board operator's voice and a delay that suggested half the staff was asleep, but Talon still felt that pulse of unease running through the hull. Sarah remained unseen during approach. He didn't summon her. Whatever came next, she deserved the choice of being still or being ready. When the ship latched into the bay with a soft thud and pressure seals aligned, Talon powered down the engines but kept the secondary systems warm. He told himself it was habit. It wasn't. He secured the comms, holstered his sidearm, not for use, but because empty hands attracted attention, and stepped into the corridor. She was already there, not directly by the hatch, but near enough he could tell she'd moved when the docking clamps engaged. Her expression hadn't changed, but her posture had. Less guarded, more alert, like she'd already imagined every exit. "I'm going to step off," he said, "just to get fuel and what we need. I won't be long." She didn't move. He didn't expect her to respond. He waited anyway. Then, without words, she angled her body slightly toward him, not blocking, not opposing. A gesture so small most wouldn't see it, but Talon understood it for what it was. She was letting him go. He nodded once and descended the ramp. Vesper Station was half lit, half abandoned, a skeleton wrapped in flickering signage, and the low drone of machines too stubborn to fail. Dock workers didn't look at faces, only cargo. Talon passed 2 scrappers arguing over a broken loader and a vendor asleep beside a crate of faulty transponders. Everything stank faintly of ozone and engine coolant. He moved quickly, trading fuel credits and picking up protein packs. Sealant coils, a thermal blanket he pretended not to think about twice. No one asked questions. He was halfway back to the Marlin when he heard it. Static clicking through the bay intercom, followed by a voice that didn't belong to any dockhand. Confirmed visual, female, designation unknown, luminescent markings across clavicle and throat. Talon's pulse hit like impact recoil. He didn't break stride, didn't turn his head. Another voice answered, lower, colder. Hold the perimeter. She was recorded in the Vestra 9 auction logs. 2 credits. Human buyer. Ship ID, the Marlin. The crate in his hand felt suddenly heavier. He didn't run. Running drew eyes. He walked the last 30 meters with his heartbeat in his throat and his jaw tight enough to ache. Even before the ship ramp came into view, he knew Sarah had heard it too. When the hatch slid open, she was no longer in the corridor, not in the mess, not visible at all. He set the supplies down and sealed the hatch. His voice was quiet, steady. "They're here for you." A shape moved in the shadows of the far end of the hall, too controlled to be panicked. She stepped into the light, and for the first time, there was no attempt to hide what she was feeling. Not fear, not shock, resignation. It was worse than either. He didn't ask who they were. He didn't need a name to recognize the weight of someone who'd been owned like a secret instead of a possession. "They can't take you," he said. She didn't argue, but the look she gave him wasn't disbelief. It was memory, as if she had seen men make promises before and watched the universe crush them. The station intercom crackled again. "Marlin crew, respond. Unauthorized passenger aboard. Compliance required." Talon walked to the console and killed the external channel. The silence that followed was louder. He faced her fully. "No distance this time. You're not going back." The smallest reaction, her fingers curled once and released. The bioluminescence at her throat flickered, then steadied, as though her pulse was visible under her skin. She stepped closer. She didn't touch him, didn't speak, but the space between them thinned into something real. The silver gray of her eyes didn't waver. Outside, boots hit the bay floor. Voices barked orders. Metal clanged. Someone keyed in the manual override to the dock interface. Talon didn't look away from her. "If I open the engines full burn without clearance, they'll follow, but they won't catch us before drift." She listened, not like a subordinate, like someone weighing a choice no one else could make for her. Finally, slow, deliberate, she reached for his hand, not to hold it, just to press her fingers against his palm, marking the shape of contact like a memory. Then she let go. He didn't need translation. By the time the override alarm screamed through the bay, the Marlin was already powering up. The docking arms strained against a sudden lift. Sirens blared. Someone shouted for security to engage clamps. But the engines roared free. Inside the cockpit, Sayre stood beside him, one hand braced lightly on the console. Not hiding, not flinching. The stars bent ahead of them. She looked at him once more, and this time there was no question in her gaze. There was answer, not owned, not recovered, chosen, and worth more than anyone had ever paid.